The flames devoured the farmhouse, turning decades of hard work into smoldering ash. Smoke billowed into the night sky as the bandits laughed, their boots crunching over broken wood and scorched earth. They thought they had won, that they had broken an old man who stood alone. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have imagined, was that the man whose land they had just destroyed was no ordinary farmer. He was a former army general, a legend in wars they had never heard of, a man who had spent his life commanding troops in the most brutal battles, and tonight they had just made the worst mistake of their lives. The fire raged on, its orange tendrils licking at the dark sky as embers floated like fallen stars. The once proud farmhouse, built with sweat and sacrifice, was now collapsing in on itself, its wooden beams reduced to blackened skeletons. A group of 6 men stood around, their faces illuminated by the infernal glow, laughing and exchanging slaps on the back. To them, this was just another job, another poor old fool who had refused to pay up. "Should have listened, old man," one of them sneered, kicking a charred plank into the flames. His name was Jace Carter, the self-proclaimed leader of the Black Hollow Gang, a notorious band of outlaws who thrived on extortion and violence. "Science, you've got nothing." A few yards away, hunched over the dirt, was Elias Grayson, the so-called helpless old man they had decided to teach a lesson. His worn flannel shirt was stained with soot, his calloused hands clenching the earth beneath him. To the bandits, he looked defeated, just another broken farmer in a lawless town. But Elias Grayson wasn't broken. He was assessing, calculating, watching the way they moved, the way they held their weapons, the way they laughed too easily, drunk off their own cruelty. They had no idea that the man before them had once commanded entire battalions in the deadliest conflicts across the world. That his hands, weathered now by time and farm work, had once orchestrated strategic warfare that had crushed insurgents, outmaneuvered ruthless warlords, and reshaped battlefields. Jace lit a cigar off the burning wreckage, inhaling deep before exhaling a slow, taunting cloud of smoke. "Hope you enjoy sleeping under the stars, Grandpa. This here's our land now." The other bandits chuckled, turning to their horses, already convinced that the job was done. Elias remained kneeling in the dirt, his silver hair catching the light of the inferno, his face unreadable. A deep breath filled his lungs. The smoke, the heat, the destruction. It should have made him crumble. But instead, it awakened something inside him, something they weren't ready for. Tonight, they hadn't just burned down a farm. They had declared war. Elias Grayson remained kneeling in the dirt, his expression calm despite the raging inferno behind him. The Black Hollow Gang had made a critical error. They had assumed he was just another weak-old farmer, a relic of a forgotten past. But Elias had spent his life in wars they couldn't even comprehend. He had commanded soldiers in battlefields where every decision meant life or death. And now these men, these arrogant, reckless men, had brought war to his doorstep. Slowly he stood, brushing the ash from his jeans, his eyes, steel grey and hardened by years of experience, locked onto Jace Carter as he and his men mounted their horses. They were still laughing, still celebrating their destruction, oblivious to the fact that their fates had just been sealed. Jace took one last drag of his cigar before flicking it into the dirt. "Let this be a lesson, old man. Next time, don't cross us." He pulled on his reins, turning his horse toward the open fields. The others followed, their silhouettes fading into the darkness. Elias didn't move. He watched their retreat, committing their faces, their voices, their movements to memory. Every step they took away from his land was another second closer to their reckoning. When the last bandit disappeared into the night, he turned back toward the ruins of his home. The embers crackled, casting an eerie glow over the wreckage. He walked through what remained. His wife's old rocking chair was nothing but splintered wood, the kitchen table reduced to smoldering fragments. He knelt down, running his fingers over the dirt, feeling the weight of everything that had been taken from him. And then, with the same measured precision that had once made him a legend on the battlefield, he reached into the ashes and pulled out a small metal box. Inside, untouched by the fire, lay a service pistol and a worn military badge. His past had been buried for years, but tonight it would rise again. He closed the box and stood, his jaw set, his mind already forming a plan. The Black Hollow Gang thought they had destroyed him. What they didn't realize was that they had just given him a reason to remind the world exactly who Elias Grayson was, and by the time the sun rose, the hunt would begin. Elias Grayson didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the ruins of his home, meticulously preparing for what was to come. The weight of his military badge rested heavy in his palm, a stark reminder of the man he used to be. It had been years since he last wielded a weapon in combat, but muscle memory never faded. His hands moved with practiced ease as he inspected the Colt Peacemaker from his lockbox. Ensuring the cylinder turned smoothly, the hammer clicked into place without resistance. Then came his rifle, a Winchester Model 1873, pulled from a hidden compartment beneath the barn floorboards, miraculously untouched by the flames. He loaded it methodically, his mind already constructing a battle plan. The Black Hollow Gang wasn't a group of common outlaws. They were vicious, coordinated, and fearless, at least against farmers who couldn't fight back. But Elias knew men like them. He had fought their kind on battlefields in distant lands, men who thrived on violence, who believed fear was their greatest weapon. What they didn't understand was that true warriors didn't fear death. They embraced it as an old acquaintance. Dawn painted the sky in muted oranges and reds by the time he saddled his horse. He rode hard, pushing the animal faster than he had in years, but his mind remained eerily calm. He knew exactly where to find them. The Black Hollow Gang operated out of an abandoned trading post deep in the valley, a place they had claimed as their own. It was well fortified, with guards at the perimeter, but they had grown too comfortable, too arrogant. They never expected retaliation. Elias stopped at the ridge overlooking the outlaws' hideout. He surveyed the camp, counting 8 men moving about, unaware of the predator watching them. Jace Carter sat at a table outside the main building, laughing with his men over whiskey and stolen goods. Elias dismounted silently, tying his horse to a tree before creeping through the underbrush. Years of military experience had taught him patience. His approach was slow, deliberate. He had no plans for an all-out assault. This would be precise, controlled. One by one, he would pick them off until Jace Carter was the only one left to understand what true fear felt like. He positioned himself behind a stack of crates, the first bandit, Reed, standing just a few feet away, his back turned. Elias exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The rifle barked, and Reed dropped without a sound. The camp went still. "Who the hell?" One of the outlaws barely had time to turn before Elias fired again. The second man collapsed against the wall of the trading post, his body slumping lifelessly. Panic erupted. Men scrambled for cover, shouting orders. Jace Carter stood, eyes scanning the tree line. "Who's out there?" His voice carried that same arrogance, but Elias could hear the thread of unease beneath it. Elias remained silent. He shifted positions, moving like a ghost between shadows, using the camp's own layout against them. A third shot rang out, and another bandit fell. Carter cursed. "It's him, the damn farmer." Elias allowed himself a slight smile. They were beginning to understand. The outlaws fired wildly into the trees, their bullets thudding into empty spaces. They had no discipline, no strategy, just desperation. And Elias thrived in moments like these. As the numbers dwindled, Carter's men began to retreat, but Elias wasn't going to let them escape. He emerged from the shadows, standing tall as he reloaded. The remaining men froze at the sight of him. "Run," Elias said, his voice low, calm. They did. All except Jace Carter, who stood rooted in place, his fingers twitching toward the revolver on his hip. Elias cocked his rifle. "You burned my home," he said. "Now it's time to see if you can stand the fire." Jace went for his gun. Elias fired first. Jace Carter's body hit the ground hard, his revolver clattering uselessly beside him. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as he clutched his bleeding shoulder. Elias had aimed to wound, not kill, not yet. The leader of the Black Hollow Gang needed to feel what fear truly was before meeting his end. The remaining outlaws had scattered, disappearing into the dense forest. Elias knew they wouldn't be back. Men like them didn't return to fight when the tables turned against them. But Carter wasn't so lucky. He was the kind who thought himself untouchable, who believed his reputation would shield him from consequences. Tonight, Elias had torn that illusion apart. Elias stepped closer, his boots crunching against the dirt. Carter groaned, trying to push himself up. but Elias pressed his rifle barrel against the man's temple, halting any further movement. "Go on," Elias said, voice eerily steady. "Say something. Talk like you did when you set my home on fire. Tell me how it felt to destroy everything I built." Carter swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. His cocky grin was long gone. "I didn't know it was your place," he gasped. Elias scoffed. "Would it have mattered?" Silence. The sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows over the abandoned trading post. Smoke still lingered in the air, remnants of the previous night's destruction. Elias knelt beside Carter, forcing him to meet his gaze. "Let me tell you what's going to happen. You're going to tell me where the rest of your gang went. You're going to tell me everything about your operations, your suppliers, your hideouts, and if I think for 1 second that you're lying..." He pulled his knife from his belt, running the blade slowly against Carter's jawline. "You won't like what comes next." Carter's breath hitched. His bravado cracked. They rode south, towards Hollow Creek. "That's where we keep most of the supplies and stolen goods. Please..." Elias studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good. Now one last thing. Who gave the order to burn my home?" Carter hesitated. Elias pressed the knife just a little harder. "I swear, it wasn't me," Carter blurted. "It was Blackwell, Mason Blackwell. He's the one running things. Elias didn't wait for the rest. With a swift motion, he struck Carter across the temple with the butt of his rifle. The outlaw slumped to the ground, unconscious. Standing, Elias took a deep breath, his mind already calculating his next move. The real hunt had just begun. Jace Carter's body hit the ground hard, his revolver clattering uselessly beside him. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as he clutched his bleeding shoulder. Elias had aimed to wound, not kill, not yet. The leader of the Black Hollow gang needed to feel what fear truly was before meeting his end. The remaining outlaws had scattered, disappearing into the dense forest. Elias knew they wouldn't be back. Men like them didn't return to fight when the tables turned against them. But Carter wasn't so lucky. He was the kind who thought himself untouchable, who believed his reputation would shield him from consequences. Tonight, Elias had torn that illusion apart. Elias stepped closer, his boots crunching against the dirt. Carter groaned, trying to push himself up. But Elias pressed his rifle barrel against the man's temple, halting any further movement. "Go on," Elias said, voice eerily steady. "Say something. Talk like you did when you set my home on fire. Tell me how it felt to destroy everything I built." Carter swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. His cocky grin was long gone. "I didn't know it was your place," he gasped. Elias scoffed. "Would it have mattered?" Silence. The sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows over the abandoned trading post. Smoke still lingered in the air, remnants of the previous night's destruction. Elias knelt beside Carter, forcing him to meet his gaze. "Let me tell you what's going to happen. You're going to tell me where the rest of your gang went. You're going to tell me everything about your operations, your suppliers, your hideouts, and if I think for 1 second that you're lying..." He pulled his knife from his belt, running the blade slowly against Carter's jawline. "You won't like what comes next." Carter's breath hitched. His bravado cracked. They rode south, towards Hollow Creek. "That's where we keep most of the supplies and stolen goods. Please..." Elias studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good. Now one last thing. Who gave the order to burn my home?" Carter hesitated. Elias pressed the knife just a little harder. "I swear, it wasn't me," Carter blurted. "It was Blackwell, Mason Blackwell. He's the one running things. Elias didn't wait for the rest. With a swift motion, he struck Carter across the temple with the butt of his rifle. The outlaw slumped to the ground, unconscious. Standing, Elias took a deep breath, his mind already calculating his next move. The real hunt had just begun. Elias studied Claire Lawson. She had the look of someone who had spent more time on horseback than anywhere else, with sun-creased skin and a gaze that was far too sharp for a casual traveler. A fighter, no doubt, maybe even a killer. "You got business with Blackwell?" Elias asked, leaning against the bar. Claire smirked and took a slow sip of her whiskey. "More than you know." Porter, the old bartender, chuckled under his breath. "Son, if you're going after Mason Blackwell, she's the best shot you've got." Elias wasn't in the habit of trusting strangers, But if Claire had a score to settle, that meant she was motivated, and motivated people were useful. "What did he take from you?" he asked. Claire's smirk faded. Her fingers drummed lightly against her glass, her expression darkening. "My brother. Blackwell put a bullet in him last winter. Shot him in the back like a coward. No law in these parts would touch him, so I figured I'd do the job myself." Elias nodded. He understood that kind of anger, the kind that settled deep in your bones and wouldn't let you rest until it was answered. "I need information," he said. "And men." Claire studied him for a moment before nodding. "I can get you one of those." Elias arched an eyebrow. Claire smirked again, this time with a glint of amusement. "The men part's on you, but I know Blackwell's hideout like the back of my hand. He's got about 15 men, all well-armed, all killers. But they're lazy. They think no one's coming for them. That's where we have the advantage." Elias exhaled slowly. 15 men wasn't impossible, but it wasn't easy either. He'd faced worse odds before, but never alone. "There's an old ranch about 2 miles from Hollow Creek," Claire continued. "A man named Randall Cross runs it. Used to be a lawman, but after the war he had enough of fighting. Still, he's got a few good men, if you can convince him." Elias straightened. "Then he's our next stop." Porter let out a low whistle. "You're really doing this, huh?" Elias adjusted the strap on his rifle. "Blackwell made sure I don't have a home to go back to." Porter nodded grimly. "Just watch yourself, General. Blackwell ain't a fool. He's got eyes everywhere." Elias and Claire stepped outside, the heat of the afternoon sun beating down on the dusty town. Their horses waited, restless and ready. "You sure about this?" Claire asked. Elias mounted his horse, gripping the reins tight. "I never start a fight I don't intend to finish." Claire grinned and swung up onto her saddle. "Then let's go recruit ourselves some guns." The two of them rode out of Sutter's Mill, heading toward the old ranch where they hoped to find reinforcements. But deep in the shadows of the town, unseen eyes were already watching, and before the sun set, Mason Blackwell would know that Elias Grayson was coming for him. Elias and Claire rode through the dry, rolling plains, the wind whipping dust around them. The ride to Randall Cross's ranch was quiet, but tension thickened the air. Claire was a mystery, and Elias wasn't the type to trust easily. After an hour, Claire broke the silence. "You ever lose someone to Blackwell?" Elias's jaw tightened. He didn't like talking about the past, but something about Claire's voice, the way she asked, made it impossible to ignore. "My wife," he said flatly. "Blackwell burned our farm to the ground with her inside." Claire's fingers tightened on her reins. "I'm sorry." Elias gave a small nod. He had heard plenty of condolences before, but most of them meant nothing. Claire's, however, felt real. Maybe because she had her own ghosts. "Your brother," Elias said after a moment. "Was he your only family?" Claire hesitated, then exhaled. "Yeah, just me and him since we were kids. We ran cattle, tried to stay out of trouble. But trouble found us anyway." They rode in silence for a while longer, the weight of old wounds sitting between them like an unspoken agreement. When they reached Cross's ranch, the sun was hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows over the land. The ranch was well maintained. Strong fences, sturdy barns, and a main house that had been built to withstand more than just the elements. A group of men stood near the corral, watching their approach. One of them stepped forward, a tall man with graying hair and a steady gaze. Randall Cross. "Didn't expect to see you again, Grayson," Cross said, arms folded. "Not after you walked away from all this." Elias dismounted and met his gaze. "Didn't have a reason to fight then. I do now." Cross sighed and glanced at Claire. "And her." Claire swung off her horse with ease. "I have my own reasons." Cross studied them for a moment, then gestured for them to follow him to the porch. They sat down, the air thick with unspoken words. "I know what you're asking," Cross said finally. "And the answer's no." Elias leaned forward. "You haven't even heard the question." Cross snorted. "Don't need to. You're riding in here, looking for men to go up against Blackwell. I got a ranch to run. I fought my wars, Grayson. I buried enough men." Elias clenched his fists. "So did I." Cross shook his head. "Then you know damn well what this kind of fight costs." A heavy silence followed. Claire, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward. "Randall, we're not asking you to pick a fight. Blackwell already brought the fight to us. He's going to keep burning and killing until someone stops him." Cross looked at her, something shifting in his expression. Claire, your brother, he was a good man. She swallowed hard but nodded. Cross exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. I got 5 men here, all good shots. I won't ask them to risk their lives for this. Elias met his gaze. Then let me talk to them. Cross hesitated, then finally nodded. They make their own choices. You got till morning. Elias stood. That's all I need. As the sun set behind the mountains, Elias and Claire prepared to do something they had never done before. Convince men to ride into a fight they might not come back from. The night was cool, the kind that settled deep into the bones. The ranch hands gathered in the barn, lanterns casting flickering shadows against the wooden beams. Elias and Claire stood in front of them, their faces lit by the dim glow. 5 men, all rough, sun-worn and skeptical, watched them with crossed arms and guarded expressions. Elias wasn't a man of many words, but he knew that if they were going to stand a chance against Blackwell, he needed these men. I know what you're thinking, Elias began, his voice low and steady. You got families, land to work, lives that don't involve chasing down men who deserve the rope. One of the ranch hands, a burly man named Carter, scoffed. That about sums it up. Elias nodded. I walked away from this life once, thought I could leave it behind. But men like Blackwell don't let you walk away. They take everything. They took my wife. They took her brother, he said, tilting his head toward Claire. And now they'll keep taking unless we stop them. Another man, younger, with a scar running down his cheek, shifted his weight. That's a fight for the law, not us. Elias gave a dry chuckle. You think the law's coming? You think they care about a burned farm, a few dead ranchers? The law's in Blackwell's pocket, same as half the men in the next town over. You ride with me. You're the only law that matters. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the creak of the barn door as Randall Cross stepped inside. He leaned against a post, arms crossed, watching. Carter's jaw tightened. Even if we wanted to, how do you know we'd stand a chance? Blackwell's got numbers. He's got firepower. He's got men willing to kill for him. Elias met his gaze. And I've got something better. Carter narrowed his eyes. And what's that? Elias stepped forward, his voice dropping lower. I know how men like Blackwell think. I know how they fight. I know their weaknesses. Cross finally spoke, his deep voice cutting through the air. And what exactly do you have in mind, Grayson? Elias turned to face him fully. We don't take the fight to Blackwell head on. We pick his men apart, one by one. We cut off his resources. We make them scared. We make them wonder who's coming next. The younger ranch hand with the scar rubbed his jaw. Guerrilla tactics. Elias nodded. That's right. Hit hard. Hit fast. Make 'em bleed before they even know where the attack's coming from. The men exchanged glances. It was dangerous. It was near suicide. But the way Elias spoke, the certainty in his voice, it made them believe, even if just a little. Claire finally spoke. My brother and I spent years surviving in places where the odds were worse. We learned that it's not the biggest army that wins. It's the smartest. Cross exhaled through his nose. Damn it, Grayson. He turned to the men. It's your choice. No one's forcing you. A long silence stretched through the barn. Then Carter stepped forward. I'll ride. The man with the scar followed. Me too. One by one, the others nodded. Elias gave a single nod. Then we start at dawn. As the men dispersed, Cross lingered. You sure about this, Grayson? Elias looked him in the eye. Only thing I've ever been sure of. Cross sighed. Then God help us all. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the dry grass. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a warning or a promise. No one could tell. Tomorrow, the hunt for Blackwell would begin. The first strike had to be fast and brutal. Elias knew from experience, fear was the greatest weapon in war. And tonight, Blackwell's men would start learning fear. As the first slivers of dawn painted the sky in muted orange, Elias, Claire, Cross, and the 5 ranch hands rode toward Blackwell's main supply route. Every outlaw needed food, ammunition, and horses. Take those away, and they'd start turning on each other. They lay in wait in a shallow ravine, their horses tethered a safe distance away. Elias peered through his scope, the morning wind rustling his hair. 3 wagons, 10 riders, he murmured. Claire crouched beside him, her hand resting lightly on her revolver. Good odds, Cross grunted. Good odds for getting shot, maybe, Elias ignored him. "We take out the lead rider first. Carter, you and Mark handle the rear wagon. Claire, you cover our flanks." He turned to Cross. "You still know how to ride and shoot at the same time." Cross smirked. "Better than you." Elias just gave a tight nod. "Then let's see it." They moved like ghosts through the brush, spreading out in a semicircle around the dirt road. The wagons rumbled forward, the outlaws oblivious. Then, the crack of Elias's rifle shattered the morning quiet. The lead rider's body lurched backward, his hat flying off as he hit the ground. Chaos erupted. Claire's revolvers barked, each shot precise, deadly. 2 more outlaws dropped before they even understood what was happening. Carter and Mark took out the driver of the last wagon, the horses rearing as the wooden cart tipped sideways. One outlaw tried to ride for it, but Cross galloped alongside him, pistol whipping him off his saddle. In less than 30 seconds, the dust settled. The remaining outlaws scrambled to their knees, hands raised. Elias stepped forward, reloading his rifle. His boots crunched against the dry earth as he loomed over the surviving men. "Take a message to Blackwell," he said, voice low and even. "Tell him his war just started." One of the captured men, a grizzled brute with a crooked nose, spat blood onto the dirt. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, old man." Elias knelt, his green eyes cold as steel. "No, I made sure Blackwell won't sleep tonight." The man swallowed hard. Cross, standing nearby, chuckled. "Damn, Grayson, you always had a way with words." Elias stood, adjusting his hat. "Tie them up. Leave 'em with a knife and 1 horse. They'll find their way back." As the sun climbed higher, Elias and his crew rode off, leaving behind their first warning to Blackwell. The real fight had just begun. Blackwell was furious. The surviving outlaws had returned to his hideout bloodied, humiliated, and missing their entire supply convoy. The war had started, but it wasn't on his terms. Elias Grayson was supposed to be a washed-up old man clinging to a dying farm, not a soldier still capable of outmaneuvering him. "This ain't just some farmer," growled Rusty, one of his top lieutenants, pacing near the fire. "This is a damn war general. I gotta hit him hard before he gets the upper hand." Blackwell leaned forward in his chair, running a knife's edge along his palm, his face twisted into a smirk. "You don't think I know that?" He turned to Boone, a towering man with a deep scar running down his cheek. "How many men do we have left?" Boone didn't hesitate. 18 riders, plus 5 more on standby in town." Blackwell's smirk widened. "Then we take the fight to him." Rusty frowned. "And if we fail?" Blackwell stabbed his knife into the table, making the wood splinter. "Then we burn that whole damn town to the ground." Meanwhile, Elias sat on the porch of his farmhouse, cleaning his rifle. The night air was cool, the distant howls of coyotes blending into the gentle rustling of the wind. Claire stood beside him, arms crossed. "You know what's coming." Elias nodded. "They won't make the same mistake twice. Next time, they'll come with everything they've got." Cross chuckled from his seat on an overturned barrel. "Good. Saves us the trouble of hunting them down one by one." But Elias wasn't smiling. His mind wasn't on revenge, it was on survival. He had 5 good men and a woman with the deadliest aim he'd ever seen. But Blackwell had numbers, and numbers won wars. Mark came sprinting up the dirt road, panting. Riders, coming from the east. Elias was on his feet in an instant. He snatched his rifle, eyes narrowing. "How many?" Mark gulped. "Too many." Elias exhaled. "Then we make our stand here." Within the hour, the farmhouse had been turned into a fortress. The ranch hands took positions behind overturned wagons and barrels, rifles aimed toward the road. Claire loaded her revolvers, her movements quick and methodical. Cross double-checked the explosives they had hidden along the fence line. Then, in the distance, came the sound of hooves. Elias stepped onto the porch, gripping his rifle. A long line of torch-wielding riders emerged from the tree line, their dark silhouettes flickering in the firelight. Blackwell rode at the front, his coat billowing behind him. He stopped just outside rifle range, grinning up at Elias. "You put up a good fight, Grayson." His voice was loud, carrying through the night air. "But this ends tonight." Elias didn't answer. He just leveled his rifle. Blackwell sighed. "So you always were a stubborn old bastard." He turned to his men. "Burn it all." The first shot rang out. The night exploded with gunfire. The first outlaw to ride forward barely made it 5 feet before a bullet from Elias's rifle tore through his chest. sending him toppling off his horse. Claire fired next, her revolvers spitting lead in rapid succession, dropping 2 more before they could reach the fence. But the outlaws were relentless. Blackwell's men fanned out, circling the farmhouse, their torches turning the dry grass into an inferno. The flames crackled and spread, smoke curling into the sky as the gunfight raged. Cross and Mark held their ground behind the overturned wagons, picking off riders as they charged. "We can't let them box us in," Cross shouted, reloading his shotgun. "If they get around back, we're done." Elias knew he was right. If Blackwell's men managed to flank them, it was over. He turned to Claire. "Take Mark and cover the back. No one gets through." Claire nodded, grabbing Mark's arm. "Come on, kid." As they disappeared into the darkness, Elias focused back on the fight. Bullets whizzed past him, splintering wood and shattering windows. One round clipped the porch railing just inches from his hand, but he didn't flinch. Then he saw Blackwell dismounting. The outlaw leader strode through the chaos like a man untouched by fear, his long coat flaring with each step. He raised his pistol and fired twice, once at Elias, once at Cross. Elias barely dodged the first shot, feeling the bullet graze his shoulder. But Cross wasn't as lucky. The bullet slammed into his side, sending him crashing to the ground. "No!" Elias dove forward, dragging Cross behind cover. Blood stained his shirt, but he was still breathing. Barely. "You're done, Grayson," Blackwell called out, his voice dripping with confidence. "Your men are falling. Your home is burning. Surrender, and maybe I'll let you die easy." Elias reloaded his rifle, eyes burning with determination. "You really think I came this far to give up?" Blackwell chuckled, cocking his pistol. "I was hoping you'd say that." Then he raised his hand. A signal. More riders burst through the tree line, reinforcements. Elias's stomach tightened. They were outnumbered 3-1 now. Claire and Mark came sprinting back, breathless. "They tried circling around," Claire shouted. "We held them off, but there's more coming." Elias clenched his jaw. They were running out of time, running out of bullets. Blackwell grinned. "End this." His men surged forward, and that's when Elias made his decision. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the last match, and struck it. Then he tossed it into the grass. The match landed in the dry grass, and for a split second, nothing happened. Then, whoosh! Flames roared to life, racing outward in a widening arc, cutting between Elias's group and Blackwell's men. The outlaws reeled back in shock as the fire surged toward them, licking at their boots, setting their horses into a panicked frenzy. Thick smoke billowed into the night sky, obscuring their view. Blackwell cursed, stepping back, shielding his face. "What the hell?" Elias chambered another round and aimed straight through the smoke. "You came to burn my land?" His voice was steel, unwavering. "Let's see how you like the fire." Then he fired. The bullet found its mark. One of Blackwell's men collapsed, screaming. Another fell, clutching his shoulder. Claire, Mark, and Cross, despite his wound, opened fire alongside him, striking down anyone who tried to push through the flames. The fire had become their shield. Blackwell's men hesitated, realizing they had been caught in their own trap. Elias stepped forward, his silhouette dark against the glow of the fire. "You think you own this land? You don't. You think you can take what you want? You can't." He cocked his rifle. "But if you want to try, go ahead." Blackwell's face twisted in rage. "Kill them!" His men hesitated. Some fired blindly into the smoke, but the shots went wild. The fire was spreading too fast, separating them from Elias and his people. The tables had turned. Then, boom! A deafening explosion erupted as the flames reached one of the outlaws' supply wagons. The stored gunpowder inside ignited, sending a shockwave through the battlefield. Horses reared. Blackwell stumbled. His men panicked, breaking formation. Elias saw his moment. He sprinted forward, weaving through the flames. His rifle locked onto his target, Blackwell himself. The outlaw leader barely had time to react before Elias tackled him to the ground, sending both of them rolling through the dirt. Blackwell came up swinging. He landed a heavy punch against Elias's jaw, but Elias barely felt it. His body was running on pure adrenaline now. With a growl, he drove his fist into Blackwell's ribs, knocking the wind out of him. Blackwell gasped, staggering back, trying to draw his pistol, too slow. Elias grabbed the gun, twisting it out of his grip. With one swift motion, he leveled it at Blackwell's chest. The fire crackled around them. The remaining outlaws had fled or were lying wounded in the dirt. Claire and Mark stood at the ready, their guns trained on the last stragglers. Blackwell looked up at Elias, his face bruised, his breath ragged. "You think you've won?" Elias exhaled, steady, unshaken. "No, Blackwell." He cocked the pistol. "I know I have." The knight held its breath. Blackwell stared down the barrel of his own gun, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The fire crackled around them, casting flickering shadows across his bloodied face. His men, though still alive, had either fled into the darkness or lay groaning in the dirt, too wounded to fight. The gang that had once terrorized the countryside was no more. Elias kept the gun steady, his grip firm, but his expression unreadable. The weight of years of combat, of sacrifice, of watching men like Blackwell destroy lives without consequence, settled in his chest. "You should have walked away," Elias said, his voice calm, steady. Blackwell coughed, spitting blood onto the dirt. "You don't have the guts to do it, old man," he sneered, forcing a weak grin. "You're just a farmer now, not a soldier anymore." Elias didn't blink. "You're right. I'm not a soldier anymore." He pulled back the hammer of the pistol. "But I've spent my whole life protecting the things I love, and I don't let men like you take them from me." The night stretched silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then, bang! A single shot rang out. Blackwell's body slumped forward, his lifeless eyes staring at the dirt. The weight of his crimes, his arrogance, his greed, it had all led him to this moment. Elias exhaled slowly, lowering the pistol. His hands didn't shake. His heart didn't race. He had done what needed to be done. Claire approached cautiously, her revolver still drawn. She glanced down at Blackwell's lifeless body, then back at Elias. "It's over," she murmured. Elias nodded, turning to the others. Cross, despite his injuries, gave a weak grin from where he leaned against a broken wagon. "Damn, General, you still know how to finish a fight." Mark let out a breath of relief, lowering his rifle. "We should check the others, see if anyone else made it." Elias agreed. He stepped back, surveying the wreckage of what had once been his peaceful home. The barn was charred, the fields scarred with deep boot prints and bloodstains. But the house still stood. His land was still his, and Blackwell's reign of terror was finished. The survivors moved through the battlefield, gathering weapons, tending to the wounded. They had won, but Elias knew that victory always came at a cost. Claire placed a hand on his shoulder. "We rebuild," she said softly. "That's what we do, right?" Elias looked out at the horizon, where the first light of dawn was beginning to break. The sun rising on a new day. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady. "We rebuild." The first light of dawn crept over the smouldering remains of Elias's farm. The land had taken a beating, but it still stood, just like its owner. Claire and Mark and Cross worked in silence, moving the bodies of Blackwell's men to a distant clearing. The survivors among the outlaws had been tied up, waiting for the sheriff to arrive. Elias stood at the edge of his porch, watching the horizon. His rifle, still warm from battle, rested in his hands. Cross hobbled up beside him, wincing as he adjusted his bandages. "You know," he muttered, "I never thought I'd see the day a bunch of outlaws got put down by a retired general and a handful of farmhands." Elias let out a tired chuckle. "Guess Blackwell thought the same thing." Mark walked over, wiping the sweat from his brow. "We sent someone to town. Sheriff should be here by midday." He looked at the ruined barn, the burned fields, then back at Elias. "What now?" Elias took a slow breath. The battle was over, but the fight to rebuild was just beginning. "We start again," he said. "This land has survived worse than this. So have I." Claire, standing nearby, folded her arms. "I can help. I don't have much, but I owe you that much." Mark nodded. "Same here. You saved my life back there. You saved all of us." Cross scoffed. "Giant hell, I'm too banged up to ride out of here anytime soon. Might as well make myself useful." Elias looked at them, his unlikely allies. Just hours ago, they had been strangers, bound only by necessity. Now they stood together, willing to rebuild what had been lost. "Toy, you're all welcome to stay," Elias said. "This place could use a few more hands." As the morning sun rose higher, the farm slowly came back to life. Tools were gathered, supplies salvaged. The scars of the night's battle would take time to heal, but they would heal. As Elias picked up a hammer, ready to rebuild his home, he glanced once more at the horizon. The world had changed. His war had never truly ended. But here, on this land, he had found something worth fighting for, and no outlaw would ever take it from him again. This is the kind of story that proves that real strength doesn't come from power. It comes from standing up for what's right. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you liked this, there's another powerful tale waiting for you. Click the next video and see for yourself.